June 22nd, 1941. The sun rose over the Soviet Union for what would become the bloodiest day in the nation's history. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion, had begun at dawn, and by midday Vasily Gavrilovich Grabin faced a problem that would test everything he believed about artillery design. In his office at Artillery Factory No. 92 in Gorky, the 41-year-old chief designer received reports that painted a catastrophic picture. German panzers were rolling across the Soviet frontier, and the pre-war 76.2mm field guns that were supposed to stop them were being destroyed or captured at an alarming rate. The F-22 USV divisional guns, expensive and complex machines that took weeks to manufacture, were disappearing from the battlefield faster than the factories could replace them. But Grabin had a secret. Hidden in the factory's prototype workshop, covered with canvas and known only to a handful of trusted engineers, sat a field gun that wasn't supposed to exist. A weapon developed without state approval, without Marshal Kulik's knowledge, without official authorization of any kind. The ZiS-3, a 76.2mm divisional gun that combined the barrel of the F-22 USV with the light carriage of the 57mm ZiS-2 anti-tank gun, represented everything Soviet artillery leadership had told Grabin they didn't want. And it was about to become the most produced artillery piece in the history of warfare. The story of the ZiS-3 began not in 1941, but in late 1940, when Vasily Grabin made a decision that could have ended his career or even his life. Soviet artillery in 1940 was in a state of confusion. Marshal Grigory Kulik, commander of Soviet artillery and head of the main artillery directorate, had become convinced through German propaganda about the Neubaufahrzeug prototype tank that the Wehrmacht possessed heavily armoured vehicles that would be immune to light and medium-caliber guns. Kulik ordered the production of 45mm anti-tank guns and 76.2mm divisional field guns to be halted. The future, he declared, belonged to heavier weapons, larger calibers, more powerful guns that could penetrate the thick armour he believed the Germans possessed. This decision created a crisis that few, outside the artillery establishment, understood. The 76.2mm divisional gun was the backbone of Soviet field artillery. Each rifle division was supposed to have these weapons for direct fire support of infantry and for engaging enemy armour when necessary. Without them, Soviet divisions would be dangerously undergunned. But Kulik's word was law, and questioning the Marshal's decisions in Stalin's Soviet Union was not a path to a long career. Grabin saw the problem differently. A veteran of the Civil War who had joined the Communist Party in 1921 and graduated from the Military Technical Academy in 1930, Grabin had spent the 1930s revolutionizing Soviet artillery design. He was the first artillery designer to use ergonomics in cannon, construction, consulting with physiologists to optimize gun layouts before the word ergonomics even appeared in common use. Under his leadership, Factory 92 had developed the F-22 gun in 1936, the F-22 USV in 1939, and the 57mm ZiS-2 anti-tank gun in 1941. But Grabin had also learned something about Soviet artillery production that troubled him deeply. The F-22 USV, for all its technical excellence, was expensive and complex. It required highly skilled workers, precision machining, and extensive assembly time. In peacetime, these were acceptable trade-offs for quality. In war, they would be fatal. The gun took too long to build, cost too much, and required manufacturing techniques that would be difficult to maintain if factories had to be evacuated or if skilled workers were conscripted into the Red Army. So in late 1940, without informing Marshal Kulik or any state authorities, Grabin and his design team began working on a new 76.2mm gun. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Take the proven 76.2mm barrel and recoil system from the F-22 USV and mount it on the light. Simple carriage from the 57mm ZiS-2 anti-tank gun. The ZiS-2 carriage was designed to handle high recoil forces from its high-velocity anti-tank rounds. With modifications, it could support the larger 76.2mm weapon. The key innovation was adding a muzzle brake to the barrel. This device, which used redirected propellant gases to reduce recoil, would absorb up to 30% of the recoil energy. This meant the powerful 76.2mm gun could fire without damaging the lighter carriage. The muzzle brake had drawbacks. When fired, it raised clouds of dust or snow that could give away the gun's position. Marshal Kulik's artillery experts would later criticize this feature as a fundamental flaw. But Grabin believed the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. The real genius of the ZiS-3 wasn't in any single technical feature. It was in the production philosophy that guided every design decision. Grabin formulated this approach with brutal clarity. "Our thesis was this," he later wrote. "The gun, including each of its units and mechanisms, should have low complexity, should consist of the smallest number of parts, but not due to their complication, but due to the most rational constructive scheme, providing simplicity and the lowest labour intensity during machining and assembly." In practical terms, this meant replacing machined parts with castings wherever possible. It meant using stamping and welding instead of complex machining operations. It meant designing every component so that less skilled workers could assemble it without sacrificing quality or reliability. The F-22 USV required extensive machine work by highly skilled craftsmen. The ZiS-3 would be designed so that after brief training, even workers with minimal experience could build it. This wasn't just about cutting corners, it was about creating a weapon that could be mass-produced, under the worst possible conditions. If factories had to be evacuated ahead of the German advance, the ZiS-3 could be built in new locations with whatever workforce was available. If skilled workers were conscripted, younger workers or women who had never seen the inside of a factory could be trained to build it. The prototype was completed in June 1941, just days before Operation Barbarossa began. Grabin knew he was taking an enormous risk. Soviet industry operated under strict state control. Unauthorized projects, especially in the defense sector, could be seen as sabotage or evidence of a conspiracy. The penalties for such actions range from immediate dismissal to arrest and execution. But Grabin believed the ZiS-3 was exactly what the Red Army would need if war came, and war came. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German and Axis troops crossed the Soviet border. The initial onslaught was devastating. Soviet units, caught by surprise and poorly deployed, were encircled and destroyed in vast numbers. Artillery units were particularly hard hit. The F-22 USV guns, along with older 76.2mm weapons, were either destroyed in combat or captured by advancing German forces. The Germans, recognizing the quality of Soviet artillery, would later press many captured guns into service as the 7.62cm Feldkanone 288R, even retooling factories to produce ammunition for them. By July 1941, Marshal Kulik faced a crisis. The Red Army desperately needed 76.2mm divisional guns. His pre-war decision to halt production of these weapons now looked catastrophic. Kulik ordered the F-22 USV back into production immediately. Factory 92 received the order. Grabin and the factory director Amo Yelian faced a decision. They could follow orders and restart F-20 USV production, a process that would take time and produce guns slowly using expensive, complex manufacturing methods. Or they could take an enormous gamble. They chose to gamble. Instead of producing F-22 USV guns, Factory 92 began secretly manufacturing ZiS-3 guns. The operation had to be hidden because the gun hadn't been tested, hadn't been approved, and officially didn't exist. Workers assembled ZiS-2 carriages without installing barrel tubes. The muzzle brakes, the key component that made the hybrid design work, were manufactured in the pilot shop to maintain secrecy. Final assembly happened at night. By morning, completed guns were presented to military acceptance officers who had no idea they were looking at an unauthorized weapon. The deception couldn't last forever. In late July 1941, Grabin decided he had to present the ZiS-3 officially. He arranged a demonstration for Marshal Kulik. The presentation did not go well. Grabin explained the gun's advantages. The ZiS-3 was 420 kilograms lighter than the F-20 USV, making it easier to move on the battlefield. It had better ground clearance. Its more compact shape made it easier to conceal. Both aiming controls were on the same side, of the barrel allowing easier operation by a single gunner. Most importantly, the ZiS-3 could be produced in 1/3 the time for 2/3 the cost of the F-22 USV. Putting the ZiS-3 into mass production would allow Factory 92 to increase output of divisional guns by 5 to 6 times. Instead of 2 different production lines making ZiS-2 and F-22 USV guns, one line could make ZiS-3 guns in vastly greater numbers. Kulik listened to all of this and then delivered his verdict. "You want an easy life for the factory while blood is being shed at the front," the marshal reportedly told Grabin. The answer was a categorical no. The ZiS-3 would not be produced. Factory 92 would make F-22 USV guns as ordered. Grabin faced a choice that would define his career and possibly determine the outcome of the war in the East. He could obey orders, shut down the secret ZiS-3 production, and return to making F-22 USV guns. This was the safe choice. The choice that wouldn't get him arrested or shot. Or he could continue producing the ZiS-3, stockpiling guns that the Red Army wouldn't accept, betting everything on the chance that combat experience would prove him right and Kulik wrong. It was an insane risk. If the ZiS-3 failed in combat, or if Kulik discovered the continued unauthorized production before the gun proved itself, Grabin would likely be arrested. In Stalin's Soviet Union during wartime, the penalties for insubordination and sabotage were swift and terminal. But Grabin and factory director Yelyan believed the ZiS-3 was exactly what the Red Army needed. They decided to continue secret production. Through the late summer and fall of 1941, Factory 92 produced ZiS-3 guns and placed them in storage. The stockpile grew. Hundreds of serviceable artillery pieces sat in factory warehouses, while the Red Army desperately needed guns at the front. Military acceptance officers refused to accept them because the weapon hadn't undergone official testing and adoption procedures. The situation became desperate in December 1941. German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow. The Red Army, reinforced by units transferred from Siberia, was preparing for a counter-offensive. Artillery was in critically short supply. Grabin made his move. He convinced Red Army representatives to send the ZiS-3 guns to frontline units for impromptu field testing. The first 50 ZiS-3 guns were shipped to the front in December 1941. They went into action immediately, and the reports that came back changed everything. Frontline artillerymen loved the ZiS-3. It was lighter and more mobile than the F-22 USV, making it easier to deploy and reposition. The simplified controls meant crews could be trained quickly. The gun was reliable, working in the brutal Russian winter conditions that caused problems for more complex weapons. Most importantly, it was effective. The 76.2mm armor-piercing rounds could penetrate any German light or medium tank. The high-explosive rounds were effective, against infantry and soft targets, and the gun's accuracy was excellent, allowing crews to engage targets at ranges up to 13 kilometers for indirect fire or nearly a kilometer for direct fire against armor. The field test vindicated everything Grabin had claimed. The ZiS-3 performed as well or better than the F-22 USV in combat, while being cheaper, faster to produce, and easier to operate. But Grabin still needed official approval. In early 1942, he arranged for a demonstration before Joseph Stalin himself. This was another enormous risk. Presenting an unauthorized weapon design to Stalin could go very badly if the dictator saw it as insubordination or evidence of a conspiracy. But Stalin's reaction surprised everyone. After watching the ZiS-3 demonstrated, seeing how quickly crews could aim and fire it, observing its accuracy and reliability, Stalin made a statement that would become famous. "This gun is a masterpiece of artillery systems design." With Stalin's personal endorsement, the ZiS-3 underwent formal acceptance trials in February 1942. The trials lasted 5 days, a mere formality at this point. On February 12, 1942, the State Defense Committee officially adopted the 76.2mm ZiS-3 divisional gun of the 1942 model for Red Army service. Grabin had gambled everything and won. The gun he had developed without authorization, hidden from state authorities and produced in secret, was now the standard Soviet divisional field gun. But adoption was only the beginning. The real revolution came in how the ZiS-3 was manufactured. Grabin and his team had designed the weapon with mass production in mind, but now they had to prove it could actually be built in the quantities the Red Army needed. Factory 92 was about to demonstrate production methods that would change artillery manufacturing forever. The key innovation was the assembly line. In 1942, the ZiS-3 became the world's first artillery piece to be assembled on a conveyor production line. This was revolutionary. Artillery pieces had traditionally been craft-built by skilled workers who assembled each gun individually. The process was slow, required extensive skilled labour, and produced limited quantities. Grabin and Factory 92 turned this model upside down. They designed the ZiS-3 so that it could be broken down into sub-assemblies. Each sub-assembly moved along a conveyor line where workers performed specific repetitive tasks. One worker might install a particular component. The next worker would install the next component. The gun moved along the line, gaining parts at each station until it was complete. This assembly line approach had been used successfully in automobile production, most famously by Henry Ford. But no one had applied it to artillery before. The conventional wisdom said that artillery pieces were too complex, required too much precision, needed too much skilled craftsmanship to be built on an assembly line. Grabin proved the conventional wisdom wrong. The assembly line worked because of how the ZiS-3 was designed. Every part was simplified as much as possible. Complex machine components were replaced with castings that required less precision work. Welding replaced intricate mechanical connections. Stamping replaced time-consuming machine work. The result was a gun that could be assembled by workers with minimal training. And when Grabin said minimal training, he meant it. After short initial training, even teenage girls could work on the assembly line. This wasn't a figure of speech or propaganda exaggeration. Soviet industry in 1942 faced a severe labour shortage. Men were being conscripted into the Red Army. Factory workers who possessed critical skills were exempt from conscription, but there weren't enough of them. The solution was to bring in workers who had never seen the inside of a factory before. Women, teenagers, older pensioners, people with no industrial experience whatsoever. The assembly line made this possible. Experienced workers and engineers operated the complicated equipment and served as brigade leaders. They supervised the line, handled quality control, and dealt with problems. But the actual assembly work was done by this new workforce. Young factory workers who were exempt from conscription learned the process and became the next generation of skilled labourers. The system was brutally efficient. One of the most complicated operations in ZiS-3 production was cutting the window for the breech block's wedge. This had to be done on slotting machines by highly skilled workers. There weren't enough machines or skilled workers to meet production targets, so Grabin's team designed and built their own broaching machines. And they trained third-level workers, people with minimal industrial experience, to operate them. For the broaching machine, a third-level worker began to prepare in the recent past a housewife, Grabin later recalled. A woman who had been managing a household was trained to perform one of the most technically demanding operations in gun production. And it worked. The production numbers told the story. In 1942 alone, Factory 92 produced 12,268 ZiS-3 guns. Compare this to the F-22 USV. The previous gun, built using traditional methods, had taken weeks to manufacture and required extensive skilled labour for each unit. The ZiS-3 took 1/3 the time and cost 2/3 as much to produce. But the real advantage showed up in total output. Factory 92 could build ZiS-3 guns 5 to 6 times faster than it could build F-22 USV guns. As the war continued, production expanded beyond Factory 92. Other factories in Gorky were equipped with assembly lines. When the German advance threatened industrial centres, entire factories were evacuated to the Urals and Siberia. The equipment, the workers, everything was loaded onto trains and moved east. And because the ZiS-3 was designed for simple production, these evacuated factories could set up new assembly lines and resume production quickly. The production kept accelerating. By 1943 and 1944, ZiS-3 production reached its peak. Multiple factories were churning out guns around the clock. The total production by the end of the World War II exceeded 103,000 units. Let that number sink in. 103,000 artillery pieces of a single model in less than 4 years. This made the ZiS-3 the most produced artillery piece in the history of warfare. No other field gun from any nation in any war has been manufactured in such quantities. The closest comparison might be the German 88mm flak gun, which saw production of around 20,000 units across all variants, or the American 105mm howitzer, with production around 11,000 units. The ZiS-3 production exceeded both of these legendary weapons combined, and then doubled that number. The production scale was possible only because of Grabin's design philosophy and the assembly line manufacturing. Traditional artillery production methods simply couldn't achieve these numbers. Even with unlimited resources, building over 100,000 field guns using traditional techniques would have required more skilled workers than the Soviet Union possessed, and more time than the war allowed. But guns sitting in factories don't win wars. The ZiS-3 had to prove itself on the battlefield, and it did, in every major engagement on the Eastern Front from 1942 to 1945. The ZiS-3 entered widespread service in mid-1942, just in time for the battles around Stalingrad. The tactical characteristics of the gun made it versatile and deadly. At 120 kilograms, it was light enough to be towed by trucks, by American Lend-Lease Dodge 3/4-ton trucks, or even manually move short distances by its crew of 7. The split-trail carriage could be deployed quickly. The gun could traverse 54 degrees from the center line and elevate from -5 degrees to +37 degrees. This gave it a good engagement envelope for both anti-tank work and indirect fire missions. A trained crew could fire 25 rounds per minute. This rate of fire was exceptional for a gun of this caliber. It meant a 4-gun battery could put 100 rounds downrange every minute. The sustained fire capability gave ZiS-3 batteries devastating firepower in defensive positions. The ammunition variety made the ZiS-3 effective against multiple target types. High explosive fragmentation rounds were used against infantry, soft targets, and fortifications. When the OF-350 high explosive round detonated, it produced 870 lethal fragments with a destruction radius of 15 meters. This made it effective for anti-personnel work and for destroying wire obstacles and light fortifications. Armor-piercing rounds gave the ZiS-3 its anti-tank capability. At 500 meters range, at a 90-degree angle, the standard armor-piercing shell could penetrate 70 millimeters of armor. This was sufficient to defeat any early war German tank. The Panzer III medium tank had frontal armor of 50 millimeters. The early Panzer IV models had similar protection. Both were vulnerable to the ZiS-3 at normal combat ranges. The gun also used armor-piercing incendiary rounds, which combined penetration with incendiary effects. Smoke rounds allowed guns to lay down screening smoke for advancing infantry. Shrapnel rounds were effective against troops in the open. Sub-caliber armor-piercing rounds with tungsten cores provided enhanced penetration against heavier armor when they became available later in the war. The ZiS-3 was employed as both a divisional field gun and as an anti-tank weapon. Each Soviet rifle division after 1942 was supposed to have 32 ZiS-3 guns. Guards rifle divisions had 36. Independent anti-tank regiments had additional ZiS-3 batteries. The typical organization was 4 guns per battery, 3 batteries per battalion. This meant a standard anti-tank battalion had 12 ZiS-3 guns. The guns were employed in several tactical roles. For direct fire support, ZiS-3 batteries would deploy close to the front lines and engage targets that could be seen directly. This might include enemy strongpoints, bunkers, machine gun nests, or attacking armor. The relatively flat trajectory of the 76.2mm round made it effective for this role. For anti-tank defense, ZiS-3 batteries would be positioned to cover likely tank approach routes. Guns would be carefully camouflaged and dug in to provide protection for the crew. When German armor attacked, the guns would hold fire until the tanks reached effective range, then engage with rapid aimed fire. The goal was to stop the attack by destroying or damaging lead tanks, forcing the others to withdraw or maneuver into kill zones covered by additional guns. The Germans quickly learned to respect the ZiS-3. They called it Ratsch Boom, a phonetic rendering of the sound it made when firing. The nickname came from the gun's distinctive acoustic signature. The ZiS-3's relatively high muzzle velocity meant there was barely any interval between the sound of firing and the sound of the shell impacting. To German soldiers on the receiving end, it sounded like Ratsch Boom, crash boom, one continuous sound rather than the separate report and impact of slower guns. This was not a term of endearment. The Germans respected the ZiS-3's effectiveness and feared its appearance on the battlefield. German intelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 consistently noted the increasing presence of the new Soviet 76.2mm gun and its impact on operations. At Stalingrad in late 1942, ZiS-3 batteries played a crucial role in the defense. Soviet artillery, including numerous ZiS-3 guns, was positioned on the east bank of the Volga and in defensive positions throughout the city. When German forces attacked, they faced withering fire from these well-positioned guns. The ZiS-3's rapid-fire capability and accuracy made it particularly effective in the close-quarters urban combat. German tanks attempting to advance through the rubble-choked streets found themselves under fire from ZiS-3 guns positioned in buildings or behind debris. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the ZiS-3's anti-tank capabilities on a massive scale. This battle, the largest tank engagement in history, saw thousands of German tanks and assault guns attacking prepared Soviet defensive positions. The Soviets had prepared defensive belts with extensive minefields, anti-tank ditches, and carefully positioned anti-tank guns. ZiS-3 guns were a major component of these defences. Soviet doctrine for anti-tank defence called for defence in depth. Multiple lines of anti-tank guns would be positioned to engage German armour as it advanced. The first line might open fire at longer ranges to disrupt the attack. If German tanks broke through, they would encounter a second line of anti-tank guns, then a third. Each line would exact losses, slowing and weakening the attack. At Kursk, ZiS-3 batteries demonstrated their effectiveness against German medium tanks. The Panzer IV, the most numerous German medium tank, could be engaged and destroyed by ZiS-3 guns at standard combat ranges. The gun's rapid fire allowed batteries to engage multiple targets quickly. German after-action reports from Kursk noted heavy losses to Soviet anti-tank guns, including the 76.2mm weapons. However, Kursk also revealed the ZiS-3's limitations. The Germans deployed new heavy tanks at Kursk, the Tiger Way and the Panther. These tanks represented a quantum leap in armoured protection. The Tiger I had frontal armour up to 100mm thick. The Panther's frontal armour was 80mm and sloped at a steep angle, making it effectively much thicker. The ZiS-3's standard armour-piercing round could not reliably penetrate these tanks frontally. Soviet gun crews found themselves in a difficult situation. They could engage Tigers and Panthers from the flanks or rear, where the armour was thinner. They could aim for specific weak points, the gun mantelet, vision ports, tracks. They could use the new sub-caliber tungsten core rounds that provided better penetration. But frontal engagements with German heavy tanks were problematic. This didn't make the ZiS-3 obsolete. The vast majority of German armoured vehicles were still vulnerable to it, and even against Tigers and Panthers, ZiS-3 batteries could achieve kills with flank shots or by firing at vulnerable areas. But it did mean that heavier Soviet anti-tank guns, the 85mm D-44 and the 100mm BS-3, would be needed to deal with the new generation of German armour. The ZiS-3 remained the standard Soviet divisional gun for the rest of the war. It participated in every major offensive from Kursk onward. During the Great Soviet Offensives of 1944, Operation Bagration in Belarus, the advance through Ukraine, the liberation of the Baltic states, ZiS-3 guns provided the artillery support that made these operations possible. The German defenders consistently noted in their reports the heavy artillery fire they faced. Fire that included thousands of ZiS-3 guns. In 1945, during the final campaigns in Poland and Germany, ZiS-3 batteries continued their role. During the Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945, Soviet artillery, including many ZiS-3 guns, bombarded German positions in the Silo Heights and throughout the city. The guns provided direct fire support for infantry assaulting fortified buildings. They engaged German strongpoints at close range. Even in the final days of the war, the ZiS-3 remained a vital weapon. But the ZiS-3's story wasn't limited to its use as a towed field gun. The gun's effectiveness and the simplicity of its design led to its adoption for multiple other platforms. The most significant adaptation was the Su-76 self-propelled gun. In 1942, Soviet leadership, impressed by the effectiveness of German Stuka assault guns, demanded a similar vehicle for the Red Army. The solution was to mount the ZiS-3 gun on a modified T-70 light tank chassis. The result was the Su-76, a light assault gun with an open-top fighting compartment at the rear, and the ZiS-3 gun mounted in a limited traverse mount. The Su-76 combined the mobility of a tracked vehicle with the firepower of the ZiS-3 gun. It could accompany advancing infantry, providing direct fire support against strongpoints and enemy armour. The open-top design had advantages and disadvantages. It allowed better situational awareness for the crew and easier escape if the vehicle was hit. But it also left the crew exposed to artillery fragments, small arms fire and grenades. Despite this vulnerability, the Su-76 was produced in enormous numbers. Over 14,000 were built between 1942 and 1945, making it the second most produced Soviet armoured vehicle of the war after the T-34 tank. Soviet troops had a love-hate relationship with the Su-76. They appreciated its firepower and the fact that it could keep up with advancing infantry. But they nicknamed it Suka, or bitch, a reference to its open top and vulnerability. The Su-76 used the ZiS-3 gun to good effect in its intended role. Against German medium tanks, it could engage effectively at normal combat ranges. Against infantry and fortifications, the high explosive rounds were devastating. The vehicle's mobility allowed it to reposition quickly and exploit opportunities on a fluid battlefield. However, like the towed ZiS-3, the Su-76 struggled against German heavy tanks. The thin armour of the Su-76, maximum 35mm on the front of the fighting compartment, offered minimal protection, and the gun couldn't reliably penetrate Tigers or Panthers frontally. This led to the Su-76 being increasingly used as mobile artillery rather than as a tank destroyer in the later war years. Several other nations adapted the ZiS-3 for their own use. Romania, a German ally that found itself desperately short of modern anti-tank weapons, produced a modified version. The Romanian 75mm Reșița Model 1943 combined elements of the ZiS-3 with features from German 75mm anti-tank guns. At least 375 of these guns were produced. Some were later mounted on the Mareșal tank destroyer. Romania also created the Tacam R2 tank destroyer by mounting captured ZiS-3 guns on the chassis of the R2 light tank. This improvised vehicle had the gun in a three-sided fighting compartment. About 21 were completed in 1944. These expedient solutions demonstrated the ZiS-3's versatility and effectiveness. Even Germany's allies recognized its value and tried to replicate it. But the ZiS-3's influence extended far beyond World War II. After the war ended in 1945, the Soviet Union had an enormous stockpile of ZiS-3 guns. Over 103,000 had been produced. The Red Army's immediate needs were met, and Soviet industry was developing more powerful weapons to replace it. The 85mm D-44 divisional gun offered better anti-armour performance, though at the cost of increased weight and reduced mobility. The result was that thousands of ZiS-3 guns became available for export to Soviet allies and client states, and the Soviet Union exported them generously. Every nation with ties to the USSR received ZiS-3 guns. North Korea received substantial numbers before the Korean War. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, ZiS-3 guns were a major component of their artillery. North Korean artillery batteries used the guns for both indirect fire support and anti-tank defense. The ZiS-3 proved effective in Korea. Its mobility allowed North Korean forces to move guns rapidly, appearing at unexpected locations. The gun's range and accuracy made it effective for fire support missions, and its anti-tank capability remained useful against lighter, UN armoured vehicles. US and South Korean forces captured numerous ZiS-3 guns during the fighting. Some were pressed into service by UN forces. Others were studied to understand Soviet artillery design and capabilities. The ZiS-3 fought in numerous post-war conflicts. Chinese forces used it during the Chinese Civil War and later conflicts. It saw action in the Middle East, where Arab nations equipped with Soviet weapons faced Israeli forces. Egyptian and Syrian forces used ZiS-3 guns in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the 1956 Suez Crisis, and the 1967 Six-Day War. African conflicts saw the ZiS-3 in action. Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, and other nations used the gun during various wars and insurgencies. The gun's reliability and ease of maintenance made it suitable for armies with limited logistical capabilities. Vietnam used ZiS-3 guns during the First Indochina War against France, and later during the Vietnam War. While less prominent than other artillery pieces, the ZiS-3 provided useful fire support capability. In Europe, several nations retained ZiS-3 guns long after World War II ended. Austria received about 36 and kept them in service until 1991, under the designation PAK M42. The Croatian Army and the Army of the Republic of Serb Krajina both used ZiS-3 guns during the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. Even in the 21st century, the ZiS-3 occasionally appeared in combat. In 2014, during the war in Donbass, pro-Russian separatists were observed using at least one ZiS-3 against Ukrainian forces. This was remarkable. A gun designed in 1940 and 1941, entering service in 1942, was still being used in combat 73 years later. As of 2016, the ZiS-3 remained in active service with the armies of at least 6 sovereign nations: Cambodia, Nicaragua, Namibia, Sudan, Mozambique, and Tanzania. Most retained it as a training weapon or for ceremonial purposes rather than frontline service. But the fact that it was still in any kind of military service 7 decades after its introduction testified to the soundness of its design. Several nations still use ZiS-3 guns as saluting guns for ceremonies and Victory Day celebrations. In Russia and former Soviet republics, the ZiS-3 is a symbol of the Great Patriotic War. Museums and memorials throughout Russia and Eastern Europe display ZiS-3 guns as monuments to the war. In the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, and in numerous other military museums worldwide, preserved ZiS-3 guns stand as examples of Soviet artillery design. But what made the ZiS-3 truly revolutionary wasn't its combat performance, impressive as that was. It was what it represented about industrial warfare and production philosophy. Vasily Grabin understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. In a total war, the side that could produce more weapons faster would have an enormous advantage. Technical sophistication was valuable, but only if it didn't slow production. A gun that was 10% better but took 50% longer to build was actually a worse weapon for industrial warfare. The ZiS-3 embodied this philosophy. It wasn't the most powerful gun. It wasn't the most sophisticated. It wasn't the most advanced technically. But it was exactly what it needed to be. Effective enough to do its job, simple enough to be built in vast numbers, reliable enough to work under the worst conditions, easy enough to operate that hastily trained crews could use it effectively. The contrast with German artillery philosophy was stark. German guns were often technical marvels, precision-engineered machines that required skilled craftsmen to build and maintain. The German 88mm flak gun was rightly feared for its anti-tank capability and accuracy. But Germany produced around 20,000 of them, across all variants during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced over 103,000 ZiS-3 guns in less than 4 years. When German formations encountered massed Soviet artillery in 1943, 1944 and 1945, they faced artillery concentrations that their own production simply couldn't match. The Soviets could afford to expend ammunition at rates the Germans couldn't sustain. They could deploy artillery in concentrations the Germans couldn't replicate. The mathematics of industrial warfare favoured the side that could build more guns. The ZiS-3 production also demonstrated the importance of design for manufacturing. Grabin didn't just design a gun. He designed a gun that could be built efficiently. Every design decision was made with production in mind. Could this part be stamped instead of machined? Could a casting replace multiple machined components? Could less skilled workers perform this operation if we changed how it was done? These questions guided the design process. The result was a weapon optimized not just for combat but for mass production. This approach anticipated modern design for manufacturing principles by decades. Today, engineers routinely design products with manufacturing constraints in mind. But in the early 1940s, this was revolutionary, especially in military procurement, where performance typically trumped all other considerations. Grabin's willingness to defy Marshal Kulik and continue unauthorized production showed remarkable courage. In Stalin's Soviet Union, such insubordination could easily have resulted in arrest and execution. The NKVD was actively hunting for saboteurs and enemies of the people. An artillery designer producing weapons without authorization could have been portrayed as sabotaging the war effort, working for foreign powers, or participating in a conspiracy. Grabin gambled that the ZiS-3 would prove itself in combat before he could be arrested for producing it. He was right, but it was an extraordinarily risky gamble. The fact that Stalin personally praised the gun probably saved Grabin's career, and possibly his life. Without that endorsement, Kulik and other artillery establishment figures might have moved against him. The ZiS-3's success vindicated Grabin's entire approach to artillery design. After the war, he was recognized as one of the Soviet Union's premier weapons designers. He received the Stalin Prize First Class 3 times, in 1941, 1943, and 1946. He was awarded the Hero of Socialist Labour title twice. He became a full member of the Academy of Sciences, but perhaps the greatest recognition was simpler. The ZiS-3 bore his name. In Soviet nomenclature, ZiS stood for Zavod imeni Stalina, factory named for Stalin, specifically factory number 92 in Gorky. But the 3 designated the third artillery piece developed under Grabin's leadership at that factory. The gun carried Grabin's legacy in its very designation. When the war ended and veterans returned home, many had stories about the ZiS-3. They spoke of its reliability in combat, of how easy it was to maintain even under difficult conditions, of how rapidly it could be deployed and brought into action, of its effectiveness against German armour and fortifications. Soviet artillery crews developed an affectionate relationship with the gun. It didn't have the glamour of the T-34 tank or the mystique of the Katyusha rocket launcher. But it was there, reliable and effective, in every major battle from 1942 onward. Decades after the war, veterans still spoke warmly of the Trizgorka, one of the nicknames for the gun. For the men who served these guns in combat, the ZiS-3 was more than statistics and production numbers. It was the weapon that gave them a fighting chance against German armour. It was the gun that supported their advances and defended their positions. It was a tool they could depend on when their lives were on the line. The legacy of the ZiS-3 extended beyond its direct military impact. The gun demonstrated that intelligent design focused on production efficiency could create a weapon that was both effective and producible in the quantities needed for total war. This lesson influenced post-war Soviet weapons development. The AK-47 assault rifle, developed by Mikhail Kalashnikov after the war, embodied many of the same principles: simple design, easy to manufacture, reliable under harsh conditions, effective enough for its intended purpose. The emphasis on production efficiency, on designing weapons that could be built in vast numbers without sacrificing effectiveness, became a hallmark of Soviet military design. In the West, the ZiS-3's production numbers initially seemed impossible. Western intelligence analysts looking at claimed Soviet artillery production figures in the 1940s sometimes assumed they were propaganda exaggerations. Surely no nation could produce over 100,000 artillery pieces of a single model in less than 4 years. The post-war opening of Soviet archives confirmed that, if anything, the numbers were accurate. The ZiS-3 production represented an industrial achievement that rivaled anything accomplished during World War II. It was comparable to American Liberty ship production, where standardized cargo ships were mass-produced using assembly line techniques. It paralleled the mass production of the T-34 tank, another Soviet weapon produced in staggering numbers. Today, military historians recognize the ZiS-3 as one of the most significant artillery pieces of the 20th century, not because of any revolutionary technical feature, but because it represented a revolution in how artillery could be produced. The gun proved that intelligent design focused on manufacturability could create weapons suited to industrial warfare. It demonstrated that in a total war, the ability to produce adequate weapons in vast quantities could be more valuable than the ability to produce superior weapons in limited numbers. When Vasily Grabin died in 1980 at the age of 79, his obituaries noted his contributions to Soviet artillery development. He had designed multiple successful guns. He had pioneered ergonomic design in artillery systems. He had received numerous honours and awards. But his greatest legacy was a gun he developed without authorization, hid from state authorities, and gambled his career to produce. The ZiS-3 that Grabin presented to Stalin in 1942 didn't just become the standard Soviet divisional gun. It became the most produced artillery piece in history. Over 103,000 units, present in every major battle on the Eastern Front from Stalingrad to Berlin, exported to dozens of nations, used in conflicts spanning 7 decades, all because Vasily Grabin understood what total war required and had the courage to build it despite official opposition. In museums throughout Russia and the former Soviet Union, ZiS-3 guns stand as monuments to the Great Patriotic War. Veterans visit these monuments, placing flowers at memorials where ZiS-3 guns are displayed. For them, these guns represent more than military hardware. They represent the industrial might that helped defeat Nazi Germany. They represent the workers, many of them women and teenagers, who built these guns under desperate conditions. They represent the artillery crews who served these guns in combat, who aimed and fired under enemy fire, who died at their posts when German counter-battery fire found them. The story of the ZiS-3 is ultimately a story about industrial warfare and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom. It's about a designer who believed he knew what his nation needed and was willing to risk everything to provide it. It's about factory workers who built these guns under impossible conditions, who learned new skills, who worked around the clock to meet production targets. It's about artillery crews who took these guns into combat and made them effective weapons. When German soldiers first encountered the ZiS-3 in 1942, they discovered a weapon that was mobile, accurate and deadly. The distinctive Ratsch-boom sound became a sound they learned to fear. As the war progressed and more ZiS-3 guns appeared on the battlefield, German forces found themselves facing artillery concentrations they couldn't match. Soviet rifle divisions, anti-tank battalions, and independent artillery regiments all deployed ZiS-3 guns in numbers that reflected Soviet industrial capacity. By 1943 and 1944, when the Red Army conducted massive offensives, those offensives were supported by thousands of guns, many of them ZiS-3s. The artillery preparation before major attacks sometimes involved hundreds of guns per kilometre of front, firing tens of thousands of shells in a few hours. This level of artillery concentration was possible only because Soviet industry could produce the guns and ammunition needed. The ZiS-3 remained in production until 1945, with over 103,000 built before production ended. This number exceeded the wildest expectations of anyone involved in the gun's development. Even Grabin, who believed in the gun's production potential, might have been surprised by just how many would ultimately be built. These guns formed the backbone of Soviet divisional artillery for the remainder of the war and for years afterward. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, ZiS-3 guns were still in the inventories of multiple successor states. Some were retained for training or ceremonial purposes. Many were placed in museums or used as monuments. Others were exported to nations that needed inexpensive, reliable artillery. The gun that Vasily Grabin designed in 1940 and 1941 continued to serve military purposes into the 21st century, an extraordinary lifespan for any weapon system. Today, the ZiS-3 is remembered as a masterpiece of military industrial design, not because it was the most powerful gun, not because it had revolutionary technical features, but because it was exactly what it needed to be at exactly the right time. It could be produced in the quantities needed. It could be operated by hastily trained crews. It could be maintained under difficult conditions, and it was effective enough to do its job on the battlefield. The gun demonstrated that in industrial warfare, adequacy produced in quantity beats superiority produced in limited numbers. This lesson has influenced military procurement ever since. The debate between quality and quantity, between technical sophistication and production efficiency, continues in defense departments worldwide. The ZiS-3 stands as perhaps the definitive example of how that balance can be struck successfully. For anyone studying military history, industrial production, or weapons design, the ZiS-3 offers valuable lessons. It shows the importance of designing for manufacturing, not just for performance. It demonstrates the value of simplicity and reliability over complexity and sophistication. It proves that challenging conventional wisdom, when done for the right reasons and with courage, can lead to extraordinary results. And it reminds us that weapons are not just technical artifacts. They are products of specific historical moments, created by people making difficult decisions under pressure. The ZiS-3 exists because Vasily Grabin decided to develop a gun without authorization, hide it from authorities, and risk his career to see it through to production. That decision, made in late 1940 and early 1941, changed the course of artillery development and contributed to the Soviet Union's victory in World War II.